Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace. Pre-dawn, 1 May, YDAU, outcropping northwest of Tucson, Arizona, USA. Still. Do you remember hearing? USOUS's Hugh Steepley said, in your own country, in the late, I think, BS-70s of an experimental program, a biomedical experiment, involving the idea of electro-implantations in the human brain? Steepley, at the shelf's lip, turned to look. Marath merely looked back at him. Steepley said, no, some sort of radical advance, stereotaxy, epilepsy treatment. They propose to implant tiny little hair-thin electrodes in the brain. Some leading Canadian neurologist, elders, something, at the time had hit on evidence that certain tiny little stimulations in certain brain areas could prevent a seizure, as in an epileptic seizure. They implant electrodes, hair-thin, just a few millivolts or Briggs electrodes? Beg pardon? Arath coughed slightly. Also the type used in pacemakers of the heart. Steepley felt his lip. I'm thinking I'm recalling a tentative bio entry, saying your father had had a pacemaker. Marath touched his own face absently. The plutonium-239 pack of power, the Briggs electrode, the Canbeck DC circuit. I am recalling terms and instructions. Avoid all microwaving ovens and many transmitters. Cremation for burial forbidden. This is because of plutonium-239. So, but you know of this old program with epileptics, experiments they thought could avoid ablative surgery for severe epilepsy. Marath said nothing, and made what might be seen as slightly shaking the head. Steepley turned back to face the east, with his hands clasped before his back, wishing to speak of it one way or another. Marath could tell. I can't remember if I read about it or heard a lecture or what. The implantation was a pretty inexact science. It was all experimental. A whole lot of electrodes had to be implanted in an incredibly small area in the temporal lobe to hope to find the nerve terminals that involved epileptic seizures, and it was trial and error, stimulating each electrode and checking the reaction. Temporal lobes of the brain, Marath said. What happened was that the Olders and the Canadian neuroscientists happened to find during all the trial and error that firing certain electrodes in certain parts of the lobes gave the brain intense feelings of pleasure. Steepley looked back over his shoulder at Marath. I mean, we're talking about intense pleasure, Remy. I'm remembering Olders called these little strips of stimulatable pleasure tissue P-terminals. A P wishing to mean the pleasure, and that their location seemed maddeningly inexact and unpredictable, even within brains of the same species. A P-terminal turned out to be right up next to some other neuron whose stimulation would cause pain or hunger or God knows what. The human brain is very dense. It is the truth. The whole point is they weren't doing it on humans yet. It was regarded as radically experimental. They used animals and animal lobes, but soon the pleasure stimulation phenomenon was its own separate radical experiment, while the second-string neuro team stuck with the epileptic animals, older or elder or some Anglo-Canadian name, headed the team to map these what he called rivers of reward, the P-terminals in the lobes. Marath idly felt at the little pills of cotton in his windbreaker's cotton pockets, pleasantly nodding. An experimental program of Canada, you said. I even remember the Brandon Psychiatric Center. Marath pretended to cough in the recognition of this. This is a mental hospital, the far north of Manitoba, forbidding wastelands, the center of nursing. Because they were theorizing that these, quote, rivers or terminals were also the brain receptors for things like beta endorphins, L-dopa, Q-dopa, serotonin, all the various neurotransmitters of pleasure. The department of euphoria, so to speak, within the human brain. There was no hint or suggestion yet of dawn or light. But not humans yet, Steepley said. Older's earliest subject were rats, and the results were apparently sobering. The Canadians found that if they rigged an autostimulation lever, the rats would press the lever to stimulate his P-terminal over and over, thousands of times an hour, over and over, ignoring food and female rats in heat, completely fixated on the lever stimulation, day and night, stopping only when the rat finally died of dehydration or simple fatigue. Marath said, Not of the pleasure itself, however. I think dehydration. I'm fuzzy on just what the rat died of. Marath shrugged. But the envy of all experimental rats everywhere, this rat, I think. Then, likewise, implementations and levers for cats, dogs, swine, monkeys, primates, even a dolphin. Up the evolving scale, P-terminals for each, and each died? Eventually, Steepley said, or else they had to be lobotomized, because I remember, even if the pleasure electrode was removed, the stimulation lever removed, the subject would run around pressing anything that could be pressed or flipped, trying to get one more jolt. The dolphin probably had swam about and did this, I think. You seemed amused by this, Remy. This was totally a Canadian show, this little neuroelectric adventure. I am amused, while you make our way toward your point so slowly. Because then, eventually, Elder and company, of course, wanted to try human subjects, to see whether the human lobe had P-terminals and so on, and because of the sobering consequences for the subject animals in the program, they couldn't legally use prisoners or patients. They had to try to secure volunteers. Because of risk, Marath said. The whole thing was apparently a nightmare of Canadian legalities and statutes. Marath pursed the lips. I have that in my mind. Ottawa could easily have asked for your then CIA for, what is the term, persons of expendability from Southeast Asia or Negroes, the subject expended for your inspiring USA's MK Ultra. Steepley elected ignoring this, rummaging in the purse. But what apparently happened was that somehow word of the P-terminal discovery and experiments had gotten up in Manitoba. Some low-level worker at Brandon had broken security and leaked word. Very little else to do in northern Manitoba, besides leaking and gossiping. And suddenly, the neuro team at Brandon pull into work one day and find human volunteers lining up literally around the block outside the place, able-bodied, and I should remember to recall mostly young Canadians, lining up and literally trampling each other in their desire to sign up as volunteers for P-terminal electrode implantation and stimulation. In full knowledge of the rats and dolphins' death from pressing the lever? Marath's father had always assigned it to Remy, his youngest, to go first inside some public restaurant or shop to check for the presence of a microwave or GC type of transmitter. Of special concerns were stores with instruments for thwarting a shoplifter, the shrieking instruments at doors. Steeply said, and of course this eagerness for implantation put a whole new disturbing spin on the study of human pleasure and behavior, and a whole new Brandon Hospital team was hastily assembled to study the psych profiles of all these people willing to trample one another, to undergo invasive brain surgery and foreign object implantation. To become some crazed rats. All just for the chance at this kind of pleasure. And the MMPIs and millions and approception tests on all these hordes of prospective volunteers. The hordes were told it was part of the screening. The scores came out fascinatingly, chillingly average. Normal. In other words, not any deviance. Non-abnormal, along every axis they could see. Just regular young people. Canadian young people. Volunteering for fatal addiction to the electrical pleasure. But Remy, apparently, the purest, most refined pleasure imaginable. The neural dilettante of, say, orgasm, religious enlightenment, ecstatic drugs, shiatsu, a crackling fire on a winter night, the sum of all possible pleasures refined into pure current, and deliverable at the flip of a handheld lever, thousands of times an hour, at will. Marath gave him a bland look, steeply examined a cuticle. By free choice, of course. Marath assumed an expression that lampooned a dullard's hard thought. Thus, but how long before these leaks and rumors of P-terminals reach the Ottawa of government and public weal? For Canada's government reacts with horror at the prospect of this. Oh, and not just Ottawa, Steeply said. You can see the implications if a technology like Elders really became available. I know Ottawa informed Turner, Bush, Casey, whoever it was at the time, and everyone at Langley bit their knuckle in horror. The CIA chewed a hand? Because surely you can see the implications for any industrialized, market-driven, high-discretionary spending society. But it would be legalized, Marath said, noting to remember the various routines of movements Steeply made for keeping warm. Stop with the babe-in-wood charade, Steeply said. There was still the prospect of an underground market exponentially more pernicious than narcotics or LSD. The electrode and lever technology looked expensive at the time, but it was easy to foresee enormous widespread demand, bringing it down to where electrodes would be no more exotic than syringes. But yes, surgery, that would be a different matter to implant. Plenty of surgeons were already willing to perform illegal procedures. Abortions, electric penile implants, ZMK ultra surgeries. Steeply laughed without mirth. Or off-the-record amputations for daring young train cultists. No? Marath blew just one nostril of his nose. This was the Quebecois way. One of the nostrils at a time. Marath's father's generation, they had used to bend and blow the one nostril out into the gutter in the street. Steeply said, picture millions of average, non-abnormal North Americans, all implanted with Briggs electrodes, all with electronic access to their own personal P-terminals, never leaving home, thumbing their personal stimulation levers over and over. Lying upon their divans, ignoring females and rotting, having givers of reward without earning reward. Bug-eyed, drooling, moaning, trembling, incontinent, dehydrated, not working, not consuming, not interacting or taking part in community life, finally pitching forward from sheer, Marat said, giving away their souls and lives for P-terminal stimulation. You are saying. You can maybe see the analogy, Steeply said, over the shoulders to smile in a wry way. In Canada, my friend, this was. Marat made a very slight version of his rotary motion of impatience from the AD 1970s of time. This never has come to be. There would have been no development of the happy patch. We both went in, both our nations, in secret. Ottawa first, cutting the Brandon program's funding, which Turner or Casey or whoever howled at. Our old CIA wanted the procedure developed and perfected, then classified, military use or something. Marat said, but the civilian guardians of the will of the public felt differently. I think I'm remembering Carter was president. Both our combined nations made it a security priority, shutting it down. Our old NSA, your old C7, with the RCMPs. White red jackets and hats and white brims in the 1970s, still on horses. Steeply held his mouth of the purse, half up to the faint lights of Tucson, peering for something. I recall they went in directly, as in guns drawn, boomed the doors, dismantled the labs. Mercy killed dolphins and goats. Olders disappeared somewhere. Marat's slow circular gesture. Your point, finally, is Canadians also. We would choose dying for these, the total pleasure of a passive goat. Steeply turned, fiddling with an emery board. But you don't see a more specific analogy with the entertainment? Marat tongued the inside of his cheek. You are saying the entertainment is somehow optical stimulation of the P-terminals, a way to bypass Briggs electrodes for orgasm and massage pleasures. The dry rasp of the emering a nail. All I'm saying is analogy, a precedent in your own nation. Us, our nation is the Quebec nation. Manitoba is. I'm saying that if he could get past the blind desire for harm against the U.S., your M40A might be induced to see just what it is he's proposing to let out of the cage. His training was such that he could emery without watching the procedure. For Steeply's most effective interviewing tactic was his long looking down into the face without emotion of any kind. For Marat felt more uncomfortable not knowing whether Steeply believed a thing than if Steeply's emotion of face showed that he did not believe.